Well, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you're here with us today. This is our second session of our second year of the Disability and Arts webinar series, and we're just thrilled that you've chosen to spend the afternoon with us. My name is Amanda Noyes, and I am the Arts and Education Accessibility Director for the South Carolina Arts Commission. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white female in my mid-30s with brown hair, and I'm wearing a red and tan striped sweater today. The mission of the South Carolina Arts Commission is to promote equitable access to the arts and support the cultivation of creativity in South Carolina. We are seeking to meet that mission in part through our partnership with Able South Carolina. We know that we can't have equitable access to the arts if arts programs and facilities are not accessible. Able is here with us today to lead the presentation on ways that your organization can increase its accessibility through the practices you choose to adopt. About 2 years ago, SCAC launched our first Arts for All SC grant, which was our first large-scale effort to support arts organizations who desire to work towards being more accessible. Since that launch, our partnership with Able SC has grown. We're now working collaboratively to support arts organizations across the state in their accessibility journey. If you are an arts organization in South Carolina and are not sure where to begin or feel like you need additional support or assistance in your accessibility work, please feel free to contact me and our friends over at Able. We really would love to speak with you. I'm so excited for today's webinar. I hope that you find the information helpful. Please consider registering for the rest of the series, which will run through November. We'll then take a short break and then resume February through June. I also invite you to attend our accessibility office hour, which is scheduled for tomorrow from 3 to 4, which is an open time to come and continue the conversation. Feel free to bring questions that may arise from our discussion today. And now I will hand it over to Mary to get us started.
Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate it. Hi, all. I am Mary Reaves. I'm the Director of Community Access here at Able South Carolina. My pronouns are she, her. I am also a white woman with short, just cut my hair off, chin length brown hair, got my glasses on today, and some sort of animal print shirt that my little girl told me wasn't fashionable today. So I am really excited to talk with you all about organizational accessibility and some practices you can adopt. Hopefully this is not your first webinar joining us and that you have seen some things, because today is really not going to be an intro webinar. I am going to be talking about concepts that we have really gone in depth in many other webinars, and that's why I'm going to back my slide up. I put this slide here because I want to make sure that, if I talk about something and you're like, whoa, that is kind of new to me, that's a new concept, that's a new idea, that's a new language, we probably have covered it, and it's probably in one of these webinars, and I invite you to go take a look at that. So one thing that I did last time that I think worked really well is I did a little quiz. And all of a sudden I can't figure out how to launch my quiz. So if you are able to launch my quiz for me, it should just be should be the only quiz that is available. What I would like to do, there it is. Yes, thank you, Annie. I want you to do this quiz for me. Or let's not call it a quiz. Let's call it like a knowledge check. Take a minute and do this for me really quick, because I think this is going to give you a good idea of kind of where are you. And then Annie, for whatever reason, and y'all, Annie is our behind the scenes tech guru who's making sure that this week's webinar doesn't have all the mistakes that I did last week. I don't get to see the poll results apparently, so you'll have to tell me when folks are done and kind of where we are, if you don't mind.
Okay, it looks like about 75% of attendees have completed it, so we'll give it another
Cool.
minute or two.
There's a question if we can clarify.
Okay, so in the
Question for in the
chat,
quiz. I'm sorry, Annie, give me
Yes.
1 second. So a question came up. Thank you, David. My organization has a policy in place so that others can find out how to provide accessibility. Do you have a policy in your organization where anyone who works there can go and find out how do you make things accessible for folks? If you're a theater, do you have assistive listening devices? If you, or do you provide interpreters? Do you have a policy in place that folks can go and find the answer to those questions? Hopefully that clarifies that question just a little bit. Annie, what you got?
I was just gonna read question 4 aloud to you in case
Oh, thank you.
you couldn't see it.
All right, what are our results? What we got? How are people feeling?
All right, let me end the poll and then I'll see if I can share the results. Okay. Mary, can you see that?
I cannot. I don't know why it does that.
Okay, I will read through them really quick for you with what I see.
Thank you.
So question
Let's see it.
1, I know the definition of disability, 100% answered yes. Question number 2, I understand what the legal requirements are under the ADA for my organization. We had 13 people answer yes and 4 people answer no. Question 3, I know how to provide accommodations and or modifications if someone requests them. 15 answered yes and 2 answered no. Question 4, my organization has a policy in place so that others can find out how to provide accessibility. 11 answered yes and 4 answered no. And question 5, my organization prioritizes inclusion and ensures everyone is trained on how to do so. 10 answered yes and 5 answered no.
Okay, so we've got some folks with a lot of knowledge and some folks who are still learning. And thank y'all for putting in the chat what you could see. That's so helpful. Zoom does an update, I think, like every 24 hours that just changes everything I think I know about Zoom. So, all right, that's really helpful to kind of know where folks are. So for those of you who found that you answered no, maybe for a lot of those, go check out some of those webinars when you have a chance. And when we're walking through things today, feel free to pop a question in the chat or make a note and reach out to us. We are available to help you. So what are we talking about today? What is organizational practices? What do we mean when we're like, we're going to help you figure out with your, governance and programming and beyond some of the things we've been talking about with physical accessibility or employment. I want to go a little bit higher level and a little bit bigger picture. So we are going to talk about 6 practices that you can start with. And I don't, by any stretch of the imagination, think that anyone's going to leave here and immediately be like, cool, going to do all 6 of these tomorrow. I've been in nonprofits for a long time. I've worked in nonprofits with 2 staff. I've been on boards of nonprofit with no staff, where we were the staff. And then I'm here at Able, where we have a big staff. So we're all in different places. So I'm going to give you lots of ideas, and then I'm going to help you figure out how to take one or all and start where you start. So these are visibly in a circle because they're really kind of all interrelated, right? It's not like you do one and then you do the next and then you do the next. You pick one and they all sort of influence one another. So we're going to talk about board inclusion. We're going to talk about disability inclusive advisory committees. We're going to talk about policies around accessibility. We're going to talk about a designated accessibility coordinator, intentional professional development, and inclusive hiring practices. Again, we've touched on some of these in previous webinars, but we're going to go a little bit more. So the first one we're going to talk about today is board inclusion. And why am I starting with board inclusion? Because I really feel like lasting change organizationally has to come from the top, right? It's leadership. If our leadership is not invested in this idea of inclusive, accessible practices, then the change is only going to go so far, right? So board inclusion, board involvement is really critical. So we're going to talk about some questions that you might be asking is, how do we do this? Where do we recruit folks? What do we need to do to make sure board members with disabilities feel included and don't feel tokenized? Because that's the thing, right? Are we prepared for accommodations and modifications for meetings? If you're not, revisit some of those previous slides. So let's see if we can answer some of those questions. We do so by modernizing our board and governance committee charters to include candidates with disabilities. And in our definition of DEIA, a lot of us have been working on DEI. And if y'all have been in a webinar with us before, you've heard us talk about DEI doesn't necessarily include the A for accessibility. I've talked with lots of folks like, but diversity includes people with disabilities. Equity includes people with disabilities. Inclusion includes people with disabilities. 100%. If we're doing it well, it does. But if we're not intentional about accessibility, we're not equitable. If a person with a disability can't get into your board meeting, or if there's not access through interpreters or captions, if there's not a virtual option for folks who maybe don't have transportation, then it's not really equitable. It's not really inclusive, right? So when we're thinking about those DEI categories, that's really important. We also want to make sure from the board level that we have model language. Inclusive organizations are doing a lot about this, again, incorporating disability, but we really need to be specific about disability. Again, when you're looking at your DEI and A, where does disability fit in there? Are we really specific about that? And then something else that we're seeing, and a lot of grants are collecting this right now, is disability data. So let me make sure I'm very clear about this. You cannot ask a person if they have a disability, right? You cannot ask your staff people. You cannot ask a volunteer. You cannot ask a board member. But what you can do is create an environment where disability is destigmatized and folks feel comfortable saying, I have a disability. And then when we start collecting data and sharing that, we're like, wow, 50% of your board has disabilities? I didn't know that I have a disability. I didn't know that this was a safe place to share that. That doesn't mean folks are sharing details about their disability or personal stories, or maybe they are if it's a safe enough space, but knowing that there is leadership involved that has disability goes a long way. I've got some links here from our Able South Carolina hiring practices, and also an organization called Disability In. I do want to caveat, Disability In has a ton of great information. They are not disability led, and that is a really big aspect for us. You hear us talk about that all the time. Nothing about us without us, right? So when you're thinking about disability efforts, go to disability led organizations first. But Disability In has some really great resources, especially about encouraging that voluntary self-ID at senior levels of boards. And I've got some tools in on my resource slide for how do you encourage folks to measure that. Again, you're starting at the top. You might do this, and I'll go into a little bit more as an organization. I'll go into this a little bit more in a little bit, but maybe you start by celebrating Disability History Month and you're like, you know what, y'all, I really want us to do that this year. If anybody would like to volunteer to help me create some posts for our social content this month about Disability History Month, let me know. Right? You're not asking anybody specifically. You're encouraging an opportunity. You're creating an environment where this is a discussion that happens just like any other discussion. So board involvement, board inclusion can go a really long way towards the practice of changing your organization from the top down. All right. We are going to go to practice 2. And y'all, I invite questions. If you have questions, thoughts, comments about anything we're talking about, please pop them in the chat. The team is helping me watch that in case I missed something. So please don't hesitate to do that. I would love to hear what you have to say. So practice 2 is a Disability Inclusive Advisory Committee. Again, if you have sat through any of our webinars, you've heard us talk about get folks with disabilities involved in what you're doing. Ask questions. Not only invite them to your board, but reach out to the folks in your community. If you are an organization around dance, reach out to dancers with disabilities. But we're going to talk about, once you do this and you get connected, what are your disability inclusive advisors? What is this committee advising? How are you recruiting? Here's a big one. What if you don't agree, or don't understand their suggestions? And this is a theme you're going to see running across. How am I ensuring equity and not tokenization? So let's get into that a little bit. I've got 5 steps for creating a disability inclusive advisory committee. The first thing you're going to do is develop a clear scope. Do the folks that you're reaching out to have time? Do you know what their goal is going to be? Because what we don't want to do is start with, hey, come to this meeting and can you tell us how to be accessible? That's really broad. Do you want someone to advise you on how to make, just the building accessible, just the website accessible, all the things? Are you looking for a specific upcoming production that you want to make accessible, and you want to have accessible actors? So what's your goal? You really need to have a couple specific things. Think about how you might have your, I'm on the financial advisory committee for a board that I'm on. I know that I'm being asked to advise on financial areas of the nonprofit, right? I'm looking at how are we raising funds? How are we doing on our fundraising goals? Are we staying on budget? I know that's very clear to me. So when you create any sort of a committee, whether you can create one that is just for folks with disabilities, which might be hard if you're a small nonprofit, or you're creating an advisory committee that is disability inclusive, what's your goal? Then you really want to make sure you are identifying diverse advisors. So, I'll use myself as an example. A white woman who with my disability is impacted. I have a neurological disorder and a cancer survivor. And those experiences are going to impact how I advise, my lived experience. I also have some expertise in the accessibility space, but that's going to be very different than a person who has been multi-marginalized, maybe a person of color who also has a spinal cord injury, right? So making sure that you are diversifying not only in all the other areas that we typically think about, race, gender, age, et cetera, but also disability lived experience. So what are those unique experiences that this group is going to provide? And how are you going to actively seek their input? One of the things that we talk about a lot here at Able is, again, just because a person has a disability doesn't necessarily make them an expert in providing feedback. So it's important to also think about folks who are trained and maybe align with disability rights and justice. No group will ever be representative, right? But it's important to consult with diverse voices to inform your work. No community is a monolith. So it's likely that there might be some diverging opinions. And I think being ready to hear and discuss that is important too, and will lead to some of that structural change. So our third step is going to be clarifying decision-making. Who makes the final decision? I think advisory boards need to know that, right? Like, okay, you can discuss all these things, but ultimately it's going to come down to the executive director and we don't have their buy-in. That's going to be frustrating if that's how an advisory committee goes, right? I've been on advisory committees before and we are advising, and none of our advice is ever taken into account. And that's frustrating, right? That's not, no one wants to be asked to spend their time to come up with ideas and advise. And for it to be realized that your voice isn't being heard. And then thinking about if we do have some of those opposing opinions and discussions, how are you going to work towards building consensus? And again, establishing those expectations up front, right? Folks can know that they're going to meet 5 times a year, so that they can set up, discuss how to expand theater offerings for folks with physical disabilities, or find actors with physical disabilities to be in production, so that and how are we going to tweak the role of Atticus Finch to be a person who uses a wheelchair? How do we think outside the box? So those expectations up front are really important. Our fourth step there is compensating advisors for their expertise and time. And it really should be relative to the scope and the term of your advisory group. And I know this can be tough, especially for super small nonprofits, but I can't tell you how often people with disabilities in general are assumed to just have free time to share it wisely and come to this meeting and give all this information and advise us without compensation, where we would pay a consultant a large amount of money maybe to come and do the same thing, right? So if you're paying consultants to come in and advise you and get information, then you should be paying folks with disabilities who might be coming in to advise you. So just thinking about that, right? How you're spending your money and and if you have advisory groups that are a subcommittee of a board, or that meet 4 times a year and you're not paying those folks, then, maybe it comes with tickets to the first showing of a production. I'm heavy on the theater examples today, so y'all have to forgive me, or a gift certificate for one free art class, maybe there's pottery making in the summer. So you can think about other ways to think about that. Excuse me. And then our last step for creating a disability inclusive advisory committee is surveying your advisors. When all is said and done, get their feedback and then determine how you're going to use it. Be intentional about listening to inform your future process. I mentioned this on, clarifying on number 3, clarifying the decision making. No one wants to feel like their time has been wasted and they've given advice. Obviously, I'll use myself as an example. I'm sure I've shown up to plenty of those and given ideas that I thought were great, but that didn't benefit the organization. And I know that. But if we are intentional about getting information from a diverse group of folks for the purposes of accessibility and inclusion, then listening and being prepared to hear things we might not want to hear, might not know what to do with, might not know how to respond. So those surveys can be really helpful in not only figuring out how you're going to respond, but what folks experienced in being part of that. Remember, I mentioned that tokenization. This is a big way to find out, did folks feel like this is an intentional effort, like they were included? Or did they feel like they were invited because they happen to have a disability and someone said, bring them in? Okay, so we're going to move on from that to when we're creating our Disability Advisory Committee, just a couple things to know. The first one is that there's really not a right way. It's going to depend on all those things I just mentioned. What's your purpose? What is your organization? What's your staff size? What's your board involvement? Where are you in a huge city? Are you in a small rural town? There's not a right way. There's a right way for your organization to do it that is authentic and intentional. But experiment, create structures that figure out, what are going to work best for you. Know also that building relationships takes time. I think we all know this, especially if we've ever been in the fundraising aspect of things, or membership. Relationships are critical, and we have to build those first. We have to build that rapport. You want trust, exploratory conversations, providing a lot of context, explaining your approach, being authentic, with folks. Hey, this is the first time we've ever done anything like this. I know we're not going to get it right, but we really want to. So I want this to be an open conversation, right? So having those discussions, that's how you build a strong relationship. Plan for accessibility. We say this over and over. You're probably going to see this on multiple slides today, but asking about accommodations and then planning for that. Do you need a sign language interpreter? Do you need captions? Is your board meeting, is your advisory committee meeting going to be held in a place that's on the second floor without an elevator? If it is, do you need to move it? So planning for those. Valuing lived experience. Can't say this enough. And everyone's lived experience obviously is going to be completely different, right? I can meet another cancer survivor with a neurological disorder whose lived experience is going to be vastly different than my own. But I think in nonprofits and philanthropy, we've really dismissed or kind of ignored the value of lived experience. And unfortunately, that means we're missing out on folks who are familiar with navigating systems of oppression and exclusion, people who have advocated for policy change, even if it just meant, for example, I want to make sure I have access to my doctor's appointment with an interpreter. Many folks have advocated for these changes. Educating the community, even if it's just through self-advocacy, that is community education. We might be excluding someone who has written a blog or posted on social media. So recognizing where I said, folks with disabilities, just because someone has a disability doesn't necessarily mean they are an expert in something. We don't want to discount folks because they haven't had a typical professional pathway that we often associate with experience. So just thinking about that. And then to caveat that, prioritizing identity as experience. While disability identity is often key to the advice that we're seeking, we don't always have to equate identity with experience. So don't just have people with disabilities there. Listen and be intentional about what we're bringing to the process. All right, our next slide. And I appreciate y'all. Anyone who's been in a webinar with me before knows that usually I've got lots of fun things to look at. So I apologize because this one is just text heavy. We're just talking. So thanks for hanging in there. So what are we going to avoid when we're creating a disability advisory committee? We are going to avoid vague expectations and scope creep. We already talked about this. We're going to set goals. We're going to be as detailed as possible. Expectations about deliverables. Let's use that example of we're going to try to explore how we can expand our theater offerings and actors and revisit roles that are non-disabled folks to have a person with a disability play this role. We need to be real clear about that expectation. Like, hey, this is what we're going to do, and we aim to do it by the end of the year or we don't think we're going to be able to do this in 2024. So we're going to aim for the end of 2025. You really want to avoid not having that vagueness and, yeah, we're working on this. Just keep on coming back to these meetings here. I promise we're going to do it. That's going to be difficult for anybody, right? And I think also being mindful of asking folks to advise on things, maybe on everything related to accessibility or disability. So, if you have someone who's part of a content advisory council, the programming that you're doing, you might not want to be asking them questions about technical elements unless you know they are. So just trying to be mindful again, clear expectations, knowing who is on your advisory council and for what purpose. And then that tokenistic consultation. I want, each of you to ask yourselves before you go down this road of, are you really ready to hear the feedback from the disability community? In full transparency, my previous nonprofit experience, I co-founded a nonprofit. I am not a person with a significant hearing loss, but I was working in deafness in that space for 20 years. And our nonprofit started a program, and we were informed by the deaf community that maybe wasn't the best way to do it. And that's not easy to hear, when we're doing something and we're leading with our heart, or we have this passion, or we saw a need, but the disability that was directly impacting and meant to benefit brought feedback to us and said, hey, look, this is not really, and we had invited in feedback. So we had an advisory committee, right? And I think we have to be ready to hear what folks say. Even if that means we've created this thing that we think is beautiful, creative, amazing, wonderful. It might mean that we have to stop, we have to change, we have to shift. And so I want to make sure that we're all ready to do that. If I'm going to invite folks in to advise me, I got to be ready to hear what they're going to say. Sorry, just reviewing my notes on there. Oh, this one seems to have popped off my slide. The other one is rigid structures. Philanthropy, some of our structures are improving, we're changing, we're fluid, right? We're moving all the time in nonprofit world and programming. But sometimes we can be exclusive of people's needs because we actually are a little bit more rigid than we realize. So the disability community really values and needs flexibility, strong lines of communication. Rigidity and urgency of outputs can sometimes undermine the relationships that you've built with those community partners. So, we have to have this by this day. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we like it by this day. But could we figure out another way to get that information? Okay, moving on to our third practice. So what are our policies around accessibility? We're gonna ask ourselves, have we reviewed our policies and procedures? And what in them might be exclusive? So let's review, let's look at a checklist here about eligibility. A lot of organizations are gonna have policies and procedures around eligibility for all kinds of things. So here's just a couple of examples. Do you have policies that can exclude people with disabilities, such as strict material or tool requirements for art class? Do you have to have an easel? Do you have to have these brushes? Do you have to use oil paints and these specific brushes? Do we have a rigid class structure and deadlines for completion or practice? And again, sometimes we're going to need those things, but sometimes it's that we want them and it makes our lives a little bit easier. But can we adapt and shift so that we can have someone else participate in a class? Mandatory participation in critiques or presentations. And if you are like, yeah, no, we need folks to present this information. Do you have another way they can do it? Could they do it virtually? Could they do it, recorded and sent in later? again, sometimes just thinking outside the box. Just because I've always done it this way doesn't mean it has to be done this way. A focus on traditional mediums. There's so many ways to create and make. And I learned that every time I talk with folks from arts orgs about all the incredible ways that we're doing things. So on that one, I think just keep doing what you're doing. Audition requirements. Sometimes you have to have an audition, but do you always? I helped an organization craft a statement for a choral group where they didn't want auditions, but they also didn't want just anybody and everybody showing up, right? So we crafted a statement, and I can't remember exactly what it said, that said something about history of musical performance required or something, right? So can we do things like that? Rehearsal schedules and rigid attendance policies. Folks with chronic health conditions, rigid attendance policies has been one of the main things to get me out of something. If I just can't get there today, am I automatically out? Can I get the information? Can I watch a video? How is that going to eliminate someone's participation? Lack of accessible instruction or materials. Are things digitally accessible? I will encourage you to go back to our presentations about how do you do that. Requirements for traditional acting or instrument techniques. Again, switching it up, being creative, and flexible casting policies. We'll go back to Atticus Finch. Does Atticus Finch have to be a middle-aged white guy? He probably doesn't, right? I think we've seen multiple presentations. Could he be? There are lots of ways we can switch that up. And a big one that we see over and over is a barrier to backstage or technical roles. And a lot of times that is due to physical disabilities, but can we adapt? Can we work around that? Have we just not thought outside the box? Well, we've got a sound booth. Okay, can it be moved? Can we help someone get in there? Do we need an adaptive tool to help them, maybe limited hand mobility to use this? Lots of things we can do. So not being exclusive of eligibility. All right, we'll go to the next one. So inclusive policies and procedures checklist for accessibility. Do you have a policy stating a commitment and an intent to comply with ADA? Have you conducted a self-evaluation with compliance for ADA? There's tons of tools. I know Amanda sent those around to folks. National Endowment of the Arts has an incredible self-assessment tool. Have you had an outside expert complete an evaluation for you? I know we've done that for a lot of orgs, and I saw a lot of names on the list that we've met, and we've come and taken a tour and give you some ideas. Do you have a designated staff person who's responsible for coordinating and providing resources? How about a written policy on how someone can request maybe an eligibility policy or a practice or a procedure modification? If you do have that, do you have a written process to determine when a policy, practice, or procedure modification would cause fundamental alteration or undue burden? That is ADA language. So that means if someone requests a modification and I am like, I can't do that, that's going to fundamentally alter my programming. We really need to have that written down. What does that look like? What would be fundamentally altering a program? Do you have a compliance or appeal process to request a revision? If not, and that can be something as simple as, hey, if you're not sure about this, reach out to us. The process is it goes to the ED. We're going to talk a little bit more about who does these things in a second. Are there criteria for accessing services that could potentially limit participation? And this really kind of goes for the eligibility one as well. But, a lot of times folks will require a driver's license to check something out or to access services. That really is about accessibility, right? Do you facilitate a welcoming environment by assuring publications, outreach materials, and services demonstrate that your services are accessible? And is there a policy around that? So how about accommodations and modifications? big question, and you'll have heard me say this a ton, do you ask about accommodations or modifications? And I don't just mean for clients or patrons, I mean for staff too, for volunteers, for board members, for anybody that you are engaging with. We ask about that, right? Because that normalizes it, number one. Number two, it makes sure folks know that they can just ask. And it puts it out there. It keeps us front of mind for all of us. Our staff provided a list of accommodations, resources, and options. You know, if you are a theater that has assistive listening devices, does everybody know? Does everybody on staff know that you have those? Our staff trained on providing your accommodations? Do you have a process to follow if requests for accommodations can't be met? That kind of goes back to one we mentioned a minute ago. Do you have a budget line item for providing reasonable accommodations? I know y'all have heard us say this in every single presentation that we've done. If you don't fund it, you don't do it, right? Do you assure that service animals are allowed, and have you trained your staff? And sometimes it's helpful to have a policy, and you don't have to create your own. There's some great ones. I'm pretty sure I put a resource on the final slide for service animals. But if not, I can get that to you. But a common question that I get is, you know, we have someone come in who is terrified of dogs, and there's a service animal on staff, or there's a service animal, a person with a service animal in this class. What do I do? How do we navigate that? And you need to have a policy and a procedure and information for your staff or volunteers so that everybody knows what to do. All right, I know I'm moving through a lot of information really fast. I'm watching that chat box and I don't see anything, so don't hesitate again if you've got thoughts or questions. Practice 4, have a designated accessibility coordinator. And let me go back to what I said kind of at the outset. All of these things are the ideal, right? Accessibility is a journey. We start where we start. And you might be thinking those first 3 practices, wow, that's a lot. We can't review all these policies. I don't even know where we're going to start. Maybe you start here with a designated accessibility coordinator. So this is called an ADA coordinator, Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator. When we look at Title II, we look at legislation for what a Title II, a state or local entity, has to follow. So I'm going to walk you through what an ADA coordinator does, but I want you to be thinking about how this could look as a designated accessibility coordinator. And some of the things that we're going to ask about is, how do you deal with complaints? Are we sure there isn't discrimination, and how do we know? Are folks in the community and our staff aware of our procedures? Do we know what is and isn't accessible? And once we know what's not accessible, how are we going to change it? So again, these are ideal steps. Some of these you're going to see tied in with those checklists that we talked about. So let's go through these real quick. The first thing is complaints. Do you know how people, do people know how they can complain? So there really needs to be a clear, accessible process for complaints. And again, that might be something as simple as on your About Us page. If you have any concerns about accessibility, email blank. Who's your person? An example of this might be the designated accessibility coordinator implements a formal grievance process. Again, I know I'm talking to small folks, to lots of small nonprofits, and you know, maybe you have a team of 2, and a formal grievance process. Again, this is, I know what I'm going to do when someone reaches out in emails and lets me know that this was not accessible. I know that I have an idea of, or we have an idea of what a grievance is. If I can't talk a person through it, you know, if we can't work it through a service animal, you know, gosh, you were, someone told you that you couldn't bring your service animal in. I've let all the staff know, everyone is aware that service animals are welcome here. You know, please let me know if this happens again. Sometimes it's as simple as that, right? But if it doesn't, and someone talks to you, how can they take that one step further? Can they reach out to your board of directors? Do you have a time limit? I'm going to solve this in 30 days. How will they know that you got the complaint? Are you going to reply? Are you going to let them know? Are you going to investigate? How are decisions getting made? And some of the rest of this really goes into more of those formal, larger organizations where an ADA is required for a Title II entity if they have 50 or more staff. So how to appeal, I'm going to keep it confidential, training, those kinds of things. But thinking about a complaint policy. General non-discrimination. This is what how it's laid out in the ADA, but this is a person who's going to ensure that all programs, activities, and services are accessible. And really, our example here is a designated accessibility coordinator reviews the policies of a public library. So going back to one of those slides, a checklist, maybe someone goes through and they're like, oh my goodness, we really do have 3 eligibility requirements that are going to eliminate a person with a disability, and we don't need to. We're going to fix those. So looking at those broader things is the responsibility of an ADA coordinator or a designated accessibility coordinator. Next, we have notice is what it's formally called, but spreading the word, making sure that folks know. You put it on your website, you have it at a, you talk about it in a staff meeting, you review it in an all-staff training, you talk about it with your board. Maybe it's required for a Title II entity that it's publicly posted. So maybe you do, if you have a brochure, a corkboard at the front of the theater, you put a flyer up there that says, hey, if you need accommodations or modifications, if you need supports to access any of our programming, this is the person you contact. It can be something as simple as a flyer that says, we are working on accessibility and inclusion and we want to get it right. Let us know. The self-evaluation piece we talked about a little bit, but we don't know what we have going on unless we're looking, right? Unless we're really looking at our policies, unless we're really looking at our building, unless we're looking at our eligibility criteria, we're looking at our website. The only way we can know if it's accessible is if we're evaluating, and this is not a one and done. This really is an ongoing process. And we're going to document what we find. And our next slide, the transition plan, is how we're going to figure out what we're going to do. For the organizations that have had a physical site assessment, they get a lengthy report about every single finding. And the folks who have done the self-assessment for physical accessibility have walked through the checklist and checked off all these things. And maybe that goes in a desk drawer somewhere. I was talking with a couple cities. Entities were required to do a transition plan after the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the early 90s. And they were required to look at all these things that were inaccessible about their location, their policies, all the things that are included in the ADA. And they were required to come up with a timeline and a plan for how they were going to fix it. I was in a conversation with someone from a small town, and literally they found the transition plan in a dusty cardboard box in a basement when they were pulling some things out that had been flooded. It had never been viewed again. So that was great that someone looked at that. But if we don't do anything with it, then we've wasted our time, right? So a transition plan is just a really formal way of saying we wrote down what wasn't accessible and we've thought intentionally about how we're going to change it. And we have some sort of a time frame in how we're going to do it. Maybe it is, wow, our entire building is completely inaccessible because it's 100 years old and we're on the 2nd floor because we get it for free. You might not be able to do anything about that right now, right? But maybe part of that plan is one day we're going to have our own building. We anticipate that we'll do a capital campaign in the next 10 years to move to an accessible space. But the transition plan gets reviewed, it gets evaluated, it stays top of mind, it goes to your leadership, it goes to your board. When we are intentional about accessibility, inclusion, this is something that everybody has to know and has to look at and really be thinking about how do we achieve these goals. Maybe it's we're going to write a grant next year to get our website revised because it's not accessible. So again, documenting what isn't working and coming up with a plan of what you're going to do. Last is effective communication. And this is also ongoing. How are we communicating with folks? Do we have auxiliary aids and services? And a designated accessibility coordinator is also probably going to be the point person for, hey, we had someone email and request that make sure we have captions next time we live stream that performance. Designated accessibility coordinators, like, cool, I know exactly how to do that, no problem. So that's a lot for one person to do. And you might be thinking, who in the world in this organization is going to do that? This is a lot of stuff. So again, I mentioned ADA coordinators are required for Title II entities, state and local government with 50 or more employers, but that doesn't mean we can't have one, right? That doesn't mean maybe we don't call them an ADA coordinator. Maybe we don't even call them a designated accessibility coordinator, but maybe we know that we have a point person. Maybe it's our HR person who's like, this is the person we're going to go to. This is our membership guest relations. It is definitely helpful if it's a person who can make some financial decisions, especially if you get a request like a sign language interpreter. That's not free. You need to make sure that someone either has the authority to coordinate that or, is the person making those decisions to say, yes, book that interpreter. I understand we're going to incur a cost for that, and absolutely we're going to pay. Probably most of the time, this is going to default to the executive director, the CEO, especially for small organizations. But again, I want to kind of empower you to think outside the box. Maybe this is a really, really dedicated board member or volunteer, someone, that has time and is really invested in this accessibility component, and you've been talking about this with them a lot, and like, could I get you to help me with these things? They really need to be well trained and understand the role and be ready to think outside the box. That's the biggest thing. An additional kind of benefit for this, so helping you maybe think about who this could be, is a lot of times they're an ambassador for your organization and they're providing outreach already. And so you can expand that to outreach to the disability community. Y'all have heard me say a ton of times, brag about what you're doing. If you have recently done renovations and your building is accessible now, tell everybody, hey, y'all, look at what we did. Look at this. We don't have it perfect, but we're working really hard. Or, hey, we're having ASL interpreter on the first performance, the first Friday night performance of every new show. Brag about that. And you maybe have this designated accessibility coordinator who helps you with that. Ooh, my slide didn't change. Bear with me. Here we go. Some simple steps to get that started. Identify that point person, like I said, someone who believes in the role and really isn't other duties as assigned, right? And I say other duties as assigned. It very well may be that this is something else that is added to an existing role. But if it's viewed as other duties as assigned, it's not going to be as intentional. It's not going to be as clear, right? So spell it out. Develop your baseline. Where are the gaps? Where are you going to start? And again, I am not up here like, do all these things tomorrow. By January of 2025, you will have done all of these things. Maybe you really go, okay, the one thing I know we can do right now is our programming, because I've got a really invested board. I got some great volunteers, and we've been spending a lot of time talking about programming. So we're going to look at those checklists on eligibility, and we're going to figure out who's our point person for this. Make it a priority with your staff, your consumers, your board. Share what you're doing. I said that already. Execute and learn along the way. Be flexible, make changes when you find room for improvement, and be ready to do that. And sometimes, again, I am not immune to founder syndrome. Sometimes being willing to shift and pivot and change is not easy when it's something that we've created, but it's important, and it's doable. It's easier than we think. Our fifth practice is going to be professional development. How do we engage in intentional professional development? So I want you to be thinking about, is the PD that you offer available to your staff, your volunteers, and your board? What other kind of PD do you need? I mean, y'all are here today getting some professional development that I hope will take back and expand your efforts and opportunities. But what else is out there? Who can provide it? Are you seeking input from arts organizations led by people with disabilities who are doing the work and who are doing the work well? And how are you supporting the implementation of PD into practices? That's a big thing, right? So we're not just sitting through a training, we're really using it to shift what we're doing. So a couple other things to think about when engaging in intentional professional development is determine what type is going to be the best for your organization, and then find the resources. If you don't know, we can help. Have you already done some of these self-evaluation pieces? Have you if you identified some of those knowledge gaps? Let's go back to that programming example. You really want to expand your programming offerings, but you are realizing that your teachers aren't sure how to do adaptive art. That's a great start, right? So, okay, cool. We can work with that. We can go find a training. We can talk to some organizations. That is some very specific PD that we can do. Going to stress this again, get buy-in from leadership, because we're not going to change anything if our leaders aren't invested in what we're doing, right? If our top down, if the board is not invested, if our executive directors and CEOs and CFOs, because again, if we don't fund it, we don't do it. If they're not invested in this, then we're going to have difficulties. So what PD needs to be for your leadership teams? Ensuring that people and artists with disabilities are involved in your training about people with disabilities. Put a plan in place to measure your change, ensure your impact, and document your outcomes, right? We got to know where we started and we got to know where we go. No one wants to do training for the sake of training. I want to do training so I can learn something, so I can change my behavior, so I can be better at what I'm doing. All right, our last practice is inclusive hiring practices. I am going to go over, this is like one slide, quick, because we have a whole webinar on inclusive hiring practices, but I couldn't really talk about organizational accessibility without just doing a quick little refresher of this. So do you have an accessibility statement? Does your EOE statement include people with disabilities? Better yet, does it encourage people with disabilities to apply? Uh-oh, give me 1 second, y'all. I'm just making sure. Got interpreter switch over, and I think we froze. All right, Heather, I'm gonna keep going. I'll keep an eye for y'all. And then, are you familiar with reasonable accommodations? That's important. Again, not just for patrons, visitors, but for staff, for volunteers, for board members. Some inclusive hiring practices can include inclusive language in your descriptions and postings, an accessible job application and a process. If your job application is posted and it's a PDF that hasn't been made accessible, that's not an inclusive hiring practice. Do you have an accessible interview process? Is your location accessible? Do you make it known that accommodations can be requested and will be provided? Do you provide reasonable accommodations? Do you know what those are? Do you know what it means to accommodate and really talk about the essential functions of a job, the essential duties, and not just some of those default job descriptions we might see that's, must be required to lift 20 pounds. Must lift, or do you need to be able to move things from one side to the other? So reviewing things like that. And then inclusive benefits and policies. So all things to think about. And I put down here on the bottom of the slide, revisit the building inclusion through employees and volunteers webinar, because Marley did a fantastic job of really going through that. Before we wrap that up, though, I want to do the an equal opportunity statement revisited, because I know we're all doing job postings, and sometimes that's where we can start. The simplest is making sure that we switch up our statement just a little bit. So Able South Carolina values diversity in race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, genetics, and more. We work hard to ensure equal employment opportunities for staff and potential staff from all backgrounds. And then here's the important thing. People with disabilities are encouraged to apply. Sometimes it's not enough to just say, all are welcome. Very specifically, people with disabilities, like please apply. You're encouraged. We are ready, and then be ready. And then accommodations for applicants are available quickly upon request. So that's something really simple that you can do, change in a quick statement on your next job posting. Maybe your next board recruitment, pop that in there. Okay, I'm gonna take a swig of water and then I'm gonna wrap this up. So where in the world do we go from here after all this information that I have given you? I'm going to go back to how I kind of started things. I know this is a lot. I know that a lot of folks are really just getting into this accessibility journey. A lot of this might be completely overwhelming, like, Mary, these 6 practices, whew, where do I even start? So I got just a couple of ideas here, right? So maybe you start with celebrating Disability Awareness Month. Something short and simple. You are starting discussions of learning and awareness. Maybe this leads to self-disclosure and destigmatization. And I meant to pop this in to the slide, so I'm going to open something up really quick and put in this list of some holidays that might be just did a quick little list. We could totally Google, but I Googled one time before and I got a list of 9,000 and that was overwhelming. So here are a couple in the chat that you can start with. And maybe that's something, like I said before, like, hey, board, I really want to do Disability Employment Awareness Month. And is there anybody here who would like to help me get some content on it? If we have staff with disabilities who want to share, let's do something with that. If not, let's just do some statistics around that, right? So you're starting with a discussion. People are doing research. We're all learning together. Maybe you start with growing those DEI efforts to really include the A. You're very intentional. Maybe you have a board committee that can. Thank you, Heather. Maybe you have a board committee that exists and you are going to switch to, you're going to add in that accessibility piece and be really intentional about that. Maybe you're going to start with reviewing those policies. Maybe you've got a board member who is like, I love governance. It is my favorite thing. I'll just say that is not me ever as a board member. But I really want to dig into that. So give me your policies and procedures, and I would love to go through and highlight some things. And thinking about what might limit our participation. Maybe you start with identifying that point person who can be your designated accessibility coordinator. Maybe it's you. If you've been through every single one of our webinars and you're like, okay, that's gonna be me. I am not gonna get it all right. I don't know all the answers, but I'm gonna be the person who is going to take the initiative to start figuring out what the answers are and figuring out how to shift things in our organization. And then lastly, recognize that it's a journey, and to make organizational commitment, you start where you start. I do encourage you to make a timeline though, right? Make a goal. I really want to make sure our organization has done X, Y, and Z by the start of our next fiscal year. Or at our board retreat, I want us to talk about these 3 things. So it is a journey. It's not a start it all and get it all done in one day, especially when we're talking about organizationally, the whole structure and all those elements and pieces and parts. It is a process. And then finally, sorry, that was my smaller font there, share the progress. Like I was saying before, brag and share, but share that progress with your staff, with your board, with your consumers, your patrons, your visitors, put it on social media, talk about it. Talk about it a lot. Okay? All right, and so I'm going to leave us then with a list of resources that I promised y'all. Leave that up there for you so you can copy. And then I want to open it up to discussion and chat. Because again, that was a lot. You are welcome to come off, to unmute yourself. We got all those set up. If you want to ask some questions, pop it in the chat. Tell me what you're thinking about and what you want to know more about. See if anybody has questions. And as folks are kind of thinking about that, a reminder that we do have the office hours tomorrow. So, if you don't think of anything today or you don't have time or whatever, we do have those office hours tomorrow. Which be happy to answer any questions and continue this discussion, or actually have a discussion about any of the things that we talked about today.
This was so great, Mary. And I'm in my mind going back to one of the first slides you showed with kind of that circular graphic, and just kind of, I think it's helpful when we're looking at, yes, all of this information, and there may be something that people latched onto or felt like that feels like a good entry point for me and for my organization. And I appreciate that you said like there's not one place to start, and that each of these feeds into another, and so that can feel like you said, we start where we start, and maybe there was one of these 6 points that felt like we could start here, we could latch on to that. So I really appreciate starting there and just trying to we start where we start, and it's okay wherever you are, kind of in that diagram.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to put this up because I would love it if folks would grab this link, and I'll put this link in the chat really quick too. Nope, I will not, because it won't let me click on it. My friend David over here either will or already has. If you would take the survey and please let us know. We want your feedback. We want to know what we told you that worked and what we missed, or what you want to know more about. So please do let us know about that. And I see do we have some chats? Oh no, it's David. Okay. I didn't mean to say that so disappointingly. Oh, it's David. It's David putting wonderful things in here. Our office hours and our evaluation. Thank you, David.
And we had a question earlier on about recordings, and this is recorded and it will be up to review. So it was a lot of information. So if you want to just go back and rewatch a certain section or review, we'll have it up in the next few days. So it will be there as a resource.
Yes. Well, thanks, y'all. I don't see any questions coming in. Q&A. I appreciate the thanks, and hopefully I will.
November 6th.
Oh yes, let me go back. Thank you, David. This is our upcoming webinars. If any of you want to know what's coming next, New digital regs, that's going to be another kind of technical one, but an important one if you receive any federal or state funding. March 5th, getting creative, an overview of 3 discipline-specific ways to provide accessibility. I'm super excited about that because we're going to have a panel of folks. It's not going to be me. You don't have to listen to me talk anymore. That are telling you some folks. Assistive technology. What if we don't own our building? And then the last one, budgeting. I've told you all about budgeting, and then now we're gonna help you out with that. So that is what is coming up. So hope to see you all soon.
Thanks so much, Mary. Have a great evening, everyone.
All right, thanks. Bye.